I've preserved the emotional tone, structure, and dramatic flair of the original, ensuring it remains compelling and poignant for an English-speaking audience. The length matches the original, minus 1,800 words, approximately 13.5 minutes of reading time at 130 words per minute. English translation, 13.5 minutes. Imagine an early morning in the boundless steppes of Zabaikalai. The sky is draped in heavy gray clouds, barely letting the faint sunlight filter through. An icy wind howls, slipping under clothing, making even the hardiest soul shiver in the harsh climate of these lands. On such a day, a simple farmer, his hands roughened by years of toil on the earth, stepped out of his modest home. His breath turned to vapor, mingling with the frosty mist. He pulled on an old fur cap, rubbed his hands to warm them, and headed toward the barn, a rickety structure of darkened planks where he kept a small herd, a couple of cows and a few sheep. It was an ordinary morning, one of hundreds, maybe thousands, in his life. He couldn't have imagined that in just a few minutes, his fate would take an unexpected turn. As he approached the barn, he pushed the creaky door as usual and was about to step inside when something made him stop. In the corner, by the slanting wooden wall overgrown with patches of dry moss, he noticed movement. At first, he thought it was just the wind stirring the old straw dragged in from autumn. But then he heard it, a faint, thin, barely audible squeak, like a desperate plea. The farmer's heart skipped a beat. He stepped closer, squinting into the dimness where shadows blended with the weak light seeping through cracks in the planks. And suddenly, he saw them. Tiny fluffy bundles lying directly on the bare, frozen ground. Kittens, so small they could fit in the palm of his hand. Their eyes were still closed, blind, helpless, and their tiny paws trembled from the cold, like fragile leaves in the wind. Their thick, soft fur, like down, was coated with frost, but it couldn't shield them from the piercing chill. They squeaked, softly, desperately, as if begging for help from someone who had long abandoned them. The farmer dropped to his knees, his rough fingers hovering in the air above the little ones. He was afraid to even touch them. They seemed so fragile, so weightless, as if made of air and fluff. He reached out and gently brushed one of the kittens. Its body was icy, barely warm, and that cold burned him more than the frost outside. His chest tightened with pity and pain. He looked around, trying to piece together what had happened. Where was their mother? Why were these little ones alone? There was no sign of a cat, no hint of a nest or shelter. Had she died somewhere out in the steppe, torn apart by a fox or a wolf? Or had she simply abandoned them, unable to feed them in this unforgiving wilderness? He didn't know. But one thing was clear as day. If he walked away now, leaving them here, they would die. Slowly, agonizingly, right before his eyes, their feeble voices would fade beneath a blanket of snow, and no one would ever remember they had lived. Without thinking too long, he unbuttoned his worn jacket, lined with sheepskin, and gently, as if they were treasures, gathered the kittens into the fold. He pressed them to his chest, feeling their trembling echo in his heart. He strode quickly back to the house, slammed the door shut against the icy wind, and sank to his knees by the old stove, where a few embers still glowed. He pulled a woolen blanket from a chest, the same one his late mother had knitted years ago, and carefully wrapped the little ones, crafting a warm nest for them. He gazed at them, these quivering bundles of life, and felt a bitter lump rise in his throat. They were so defenseless, so alone, so lost in this vast, cold world. He found an old pipette he'd once used to feed sick lambs, poured some milk into a bowl, warmed it on the stove, and began dripping it into their tiny mouths. Every movement was slow, careful, almost reverent. He whispered soothing words to them, though he wasn't sure why, perhaps to calm himself. But caring for them turned out to be a test of endurance. Every 2 hours, day and night, he rose to feed them, warm them, check if they were still breathing. He placed them near the stove, added hot water bottles, wrapped them in rags, but they still shivered. Sometimes one of the kittens would go still, no longer moving, and the farmer would freeze with it, dreading that it was the end. He'd press his ear to their tiny chests, listening for the faint heartbeat, and each time they squeaked again, he'd breathe a sigh of relief. At night, he barely slept, sitting by the stove with eyes red from exhaustion, watching them and wondering, will they make it? Can I save them? They held on, weak, but clinging to life, as if they sensed someone was fighting for them. A week passed, and the farmer realized he couldn't do it alone. He lacked the experience and knowledge to give these little ones everything they needed. He feared his clumsiness would harm them, that they'd fade away in his arms despite all his efforts. So he made a desperate choice. He dug out his old phone, one he rarely used, and dialed the number for the Dorsky Nature Reserve. The voice on the other end was calm, professional, Bring them here. We'll try to find a nursing cat. It was a faint glimmer of hope in his weary heart. He packed the kittens into a wooden box, wrapped them in the blanket, tucked in a hot water bottle, and drove across the steppe. The road was long and bumpy, and he kept glancing back, making sure they were still breathing. He gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white, praying they'd survive the journey. When he reached the reserve and handed over the box to the specialists, they began examining the little ones. Suddenly, a heavy silence filled the room. The staff's faces changed: surprise, confusion, even shock. They exchanged glances, as if they couldn't believe their eyes. One of them, an older man with silver temples and a tired gaze, said quietly, "They're not what you think." The farmer frowned, puzzled. What did they mean? Then they explained. These fluffy bundles he'd nursed through the nights weren't ordinary kittens. They were Mantle cubs, one of the rarest and most mysterious wild cats on the planet. Mantles aren't domestic pets. They roam the rugged steppes and mountains, their thick fur and round faces with big eyes making them look like plush toys. But it's a deceptive appearance. Their soul is that of a wild beast, free and untamed. They can't be domesticated, can't be caged. They're born for wide open spaces, for the wind, for the hunt. The farmer stood still, staring at the kittens. His kittens. He couldn't believe that these little ones, fed from a pipette, were a treasure of nature. They told him that on the black market, a mantle fetches hundreds of thousands of rubles. A fortune. He closed his eyes and pictured it. Selling them, buying a new tractor, fixing the roof, sending his kids to school in the city. It would end his endless struggle with poverty, the sleepless nights counting every kopeck. But then he saw something else. These little ones in golden cages owned by wealthy collectors, their sad eyes, their broken spirits, their paws never touching grass. No. He shook his head, banishing the temptation. They weren't born for that. They had to be free, even if it meant he'd gain nothing. He handed the kittens over to the reserve. They began searching for a foster mother, a cat who could nurse someone else's cubs. It was a nearly impossible task. Not every cat would accept wild kittens with their strange scent and odd behaviors. The farmer waited for news, checking his phone daily, dreading the worst. He paced the yard, restless, recalling their faint squeaks, their trembling bodies. At last, they called. "We found 2 nursing cats." He went to the reserve and saw a miracle. 2 cats lay in a warm enclosure, and beside them, pressed against their flanks, slept the mantles. They drank milk, warmed up, grew stronger. Their paws no longer trembled, their fur gleamed in the soft lamplight. The farmer watched them, tears stinging his eyes. They'd survived. His little ones had survived. But as the days passed, it became clearer. Mantles weren't domestic kittens. They started hiding in the enclosure's corners, hissing at the staff, avoiding human hands. Their eyes, once so trusting, now watched warily, as if saying, "We don't belong to you." When they grew big enough, the reserve decided to release them into the wild. They fitted them with radio collars to track their fate and set them free in the steppe. The farmer stood at the edge of the vast field, watching them vanish into the tall grass. He clenched his fists, whispering after them, "Be strong." At first, all went well. They hunted, explored, learned to be mantles. But then winter came, a harsh, with icy winds and deep snow that hid their prey. The young mantles, still inexperienced, faced hunger and cold. The signals from their collars began fading, one by one. The farmer couldn't sleep at night, sitting by the window, staring into the dark. He imagined his little ones freezing out there, alone and weak, their paws sinking into snow, their voices silenced by the howling wind. He blamed himself. Should they have kept them? Should they have stayed in the warmth? The reserve staff found them, exhausted but alive. The collars had been shed, as if the mantles had rejected human help themselves. They were taken in for the winter, given food, shelter, time to grow strong. In spring, they were released again. This time, they were ready. They melted into the steppes, free, powerful, true masters of the wild. This story tears at your heart. Picture those kittens, abandoned, trembling, on the brink of death, their faint squeaks, their icy bodies. Picture the farmer who gave up a fortune for their freedom, who fought for their lives night after night. What would you do? Sell them to ease your life, to escape hardship? Or let them go, knowing their place is in the steppe, not in captivity? Mantles aren't toys. In cages, they wither, sicken, die, their eyes dulled by sorrow. Their joy is in freedom, in boundless spaces where they can be themselves. And the farmer gave them that joy. Now he looks at photos of grown mantles, captured by cameras in the steppe, and smiles. He knows he didn't just save them. He gave them a life, a real, wild, free life. That's worth more than any money.